I want to welcome everyone back to our Loved Ones sessions, and the Loved Ones group, just as a reminder for those of you who might be new to our group, is an opportunity for us to share information about concerns that we have for loved ones who have drug and alcohol problems and how we might be able to help them, and for certainly to be able to learn how to cope with the problems that go along with that. We, in our first sessions, we talked about alcoholism and drug addiction as a disease. That's the most important thing that we can continue to emphasize, that we are dealing with a disease. And that takes time for people to really become comfortable with. It takes time for us to change old ideas into new ideas in terms of being able to see addiction as a disease. But when families are able to start seeing the disease of addiction as a primary physiological problem, then other things about addiction start making sense. And then perhaps some of the things that family members and others have been trying to do to help their loved ones perhaps don't make quite as much sense and are things that can be then changed. Probably the most important thing for family members in terms of being able to look at addiction as a disease is that we can start giving up on the idea of who or what is to blame for addiction being present. And that's very important, especially for family members, especially for loved ones, because at some point in time, a loved one is going to ask that question to themselves: how did I contribute to this? What did I do wrong? What blame should I have in terms of this person and the problems that they're having? And again, what we will see about addiction, the more that we come to know it, one of the symptoms of addiction is wanting to blame other people, places, and things for the problems that are going on. Again, that's the nature of the disease. And the other part is when we can stop looking for blame for ourselves, we can also start looking at the individual as a sick person, not someone even themselves perhaps that are at fault. As we talked about in our very first session, over 90% of the people in the United States are going to experiment with alcohol. Over 50% of the people are going to experiment with an illegal drug, or a legal drug illegally. And we know that as this experimentation happens, some of these folks are going to experience addiction. And again, what we see is that it's not for us to be looking for fault in terms of where did we go wrong, where did they go wrong. We want to see that this progression of this disease started with their experimentation, just like everybody else did. In other words, it's really nobody's fault. And that's important for us to start working our way toward that idea. And then we talked about the progression of the disease. And that's very important for us to also to see. Family members are frequently caught up in the progression of their loved one's disease. It starts off again as experimentation, and then the next thing you know, there are problems starting to emerge, and then there are all kinds of things going wrong with that person's life that are affecting everyone around them. And so that progression is again, it's inherent to the disease, but family members are frequently just seeing the disease as it is as of today. And that becomes kind of mystifying to the family. They're describing, here's the current crisis, here's the current problem that we're dealing with, but in reality, it's just a crisis in a progression of crises that will continue to get worse and worse. So when a family can start to see that, then that becomes motivation also to be able to take a different kind of action in terms of being able to address the problem, because you're not really dealing with the problem as it is today only. You're going to be dealing with that problem as it is tomorrow and next month and next year. The disease is never standing still. It is always in some state of progression, even though there may be brief periods of time where the person seems to be doing better. Oftentimes after a crisis, there is this period where things seem to have gotten better. Kind of call that a honeymoon period, where the person has gotten into a crisis, the family has rallied around, kind of a circle the wagons kind of approach that starts to develop around addiction. And as a result of that, then what we see, the person gets out of that crisis, and there's this period of time where there's a lot of promises, a lot of apologies. Things are going to be different, things are going to be better, and it can be for a brief period of time, perhaps things do get better as everybody puts their energy into trying to do something different. But again, this is a disease that is always progressing, and until the drinking or the drug use stops, the disease will continue to progress in terms of its symptoms. The person will continue to become, more crisis-oriented. There will continue to be more problems. There will continue to be more financial issues. All of the things that happen will continue to happen. And those very same things will continue to happen to family. One of the things that we're going to talk about today, in terms of being able to focus on what happens next, is we're going to talk about how does someone reach a point where they make a decision to do something different, and what's the family's role and relationship to that. And I put the word up here, hitting bottom. It's a very common word that we hear all the time in reference to alcoholism and drug addiction. You hear people say, well, I hit bottom, or someone is not going to get well unless they hit bottom. And I'm going to, I'm going to support that idea. I'm going to support the idea that I have never seen anyone get better unless they have had the experience of hitting bottom. But what I want to add to that is that bottom is different for everyone that experiences it. It's not the same for everybody. Actually, hitting bottom is a convergence of events, both external to the alcoholic or internal to the alcoholic. External meaning loss of job, family, loss of respect from other people, getting in legal trouble. Those things are kind of external to the person that are happening as a result of their interaction with the society or family. And then there's those internal things that are going on. Guilt, shame, remorse, self-pity that are a constant existence for the person with an alcohol and drug problem, although you might not see that as a family member or somebody outside of the person because they're being very protective that other people do not see that. So hitting bottom is a convergence of those things, those consequences, as we're going to talk about here in the next few minutes. The convergence of those consequences that lead a person to make a decision that they want to do something different with their life. At that moment, that is bottom for that person. And it might be that a person, again, we all have this definition of what hitting bottom is, just like we have a definition of what alcoholism and drug addiction is. And as we talked before, a person is not going to get better, a family member is not going to confront this disease until we finally reach that point where we meet the definition that we have for the alcoholic. An example is, if my definition of an alcoholic is someone who's living in the park, or under the bridge, with a bottle wrapped in paper sack, if that's my definition of an alcoholic, then as an alcoholic, I am not going to see myself as an alcoholic until I meet that definition, until I'm in the park, until I'm under the bridge. A family member, if you have that definition of what an alcoholic is, then you're not going to say, my loved one has a problem with alcohol until they match that definition. So what we want to do is we want to back that definition up. The person that's living under the bridge, that's in the park, that's lost everything, perhaps we'd say, oh, that's bottom. Well, yes, that is bottom, but that person didn't always look that way. They had this disease for a long time, and that's not how they looked. At some point in time, they had a job. They had a family, perhaps. They may have been a very responsible person within the community, and they still had this disease even then. But again, what we start to see is that hitting bottom has its own definition for each person. And so our goal is to be able to, as the 12-step recovery groups talk about, raise bottom. Have it be not just that definition of the late stages of this disease, but be able to start identifying addiction much earlier, and as a result, then perhaps that can become bottom. And again, if bottom has nothing to do with just the kind of events that are happening, such as losing everything, then it may have to do with just other kinds of consequences might become bottom. But at the same time, I've never heard anybody that's recovered that got up one morning and said, gee, I just woke up one morning and the sun was shining, my life was going great, and I thought, well, this would be a good day to go into alcohol treatment. I've never heard that story. I've never heard that story, and I don't expect to hear that story. Recovery begins most generally on the worst day of a person's life. That's when it begins. At that moment when there's a feeling of hopelessness and desperation, things aren't going right, things have gotten really bad, and that has broken through that denial process. Again, we talked about denial and how powerful it becomes for the alcoholic. And something powerful has to come about that will penetrate that to kind of break open and create this little crack of an opportunity to where the person may say, I need help, and I'm willing to get that help. So hitting bottom becomes again, an event, and it may be multiple events. You will frequently hear somebody say, well, I had these bad experiences and I decided to get a little help, or I thought about it, but I didn't follow through, or I didn't do exactly what people suggested I do, and then I drank again, or I continued to use drugs, and then this new bad thing happened. And again, since the disease is progressive, then bottom kind of keeps getting worse. And we hear, again, 12-step recovery groups oftentimes refer to it as an elevator going down. Frequently, the elevator stops and the doors kind of come open and a person can step off, but they choose not to, or they can't for whatever reason. And it closes up and they go down to another level, another set of consequences that might be a little worse than before. But as we start looking at this bottom and the role that families play in this, we start to see that consequences have been happening for a long time. And as a result of these consequences, we just have to take a look at who has been experiencing these consequences. That becomes the question. So we're looking at two things that are necessary for a person to recover. Remember the old TV show, Truth or Consequences? Well, this is truth and consequences. They both have to happen. Now, the truth is a very sometimes elusive thing, again, when it comes to alcoholism. The alcoholic is struggling with it. The addict is all the time trying to kind of avoid the truth about what may be going on. That's the nature of the denial process. But I can tell you this, that a person will hear the truth at some point in time, and family members can be a very good conduit for the truth in terms of letting someone know that you think that they have a drug or alcohol problem. But before we can share the truth with somebody who has a problem, we have to come to terms with that truth ourselves. We have to be willing to say, my loved one is an addict. My loved one is an alcoholic. And as a result of that, now I can start interacting with this person in a way that starts sharing the truth. And it can come in a lot of different ways. Things that can happen is that, when you're hearing the blame game going on, a family member might say simply, I think the problems that you're having are because of your drug or alcohol use. Very simple statement. Not said in anger, not said in the midst of an argument, but just very simply stated. Now, I will not get into a fantasy where I would tell you that you can expect that person to say, well, gosh, I never thought of that. Thank you for that information. No, they're not going to share it. In fact, when you share the truth with somebody who has this powerful disease, what you're going to get back is a lot of anger, a lot of defensiveness, a lot of accusation toward you. There could be a lot of very negative reaction that will come when you share the truth. And it becomes very important that when you share the truth, you really don't have to defend the truth, do you? It stands on its own. Now, I also say that when it comes to the truth, there are sometimes some behavioral things that we can do that start to have to do with the truth. I can remember a father that came to Loved Ones group several times, and we were talking about this and talking about consequences, and he was trying to think of that perfect moment that he was going to sit down with his 20-year-old son, and he was going to tell him what he thought about his drinking or drug use, and he was kind of preparing a speech. But before the opportunity for that speech came up, his son came up to him one evening, just kind of on the spur of the moment, and said, "Dad, I need to borrow the car. Could you give me the car keys? I'm going to drive down so and so, do such and such." And his dad was reaching in his pocket for the keys, and as he was reaching in, he thought, I'm about to give my car and the car keys to somebody who could very possibly be under the influence of drugs. And so he put the car keys back in his pocket and he said, "Son, I can't give you my car because you might be using drugs, and that would be irresponsible of me." So he didn't need to give a speech, did he? He just needed to react to a normal situation that was presenting itself to him, and it was very powerful for him to be able to share the truth in that way, along with an action. Oftentimes we are thinking that, you know what, I think I can sit down and talk my loved one into recovery. I think I can reason with them. And what family members report over and over is that that's just not successful. But at the same time, sharing the truth can be a very powerful experience. I can tell you this too, when the truth is shared with an addict or an alcoholic, no matter how sick they are, if the loved one can avoid getting caught up in the argument that follows, or can avoid being angry, screaming, and yelling when you're sharing that truth, it will not be forgotten. It will not be forgotten. In fact, 12-step recovery groups talk about it as the haunting. Somebody tells you the truth, they didn't argue with you. In fact, they may have shared that information, then just walked away. And again, in the mind of the addict or the alcoholic, we might completely reject it and say, oh, they're crazy, they don't know what they're talking about, they have some other agenda. But we never forget what that person shared with us. Never. It's there. It kind of haunts us as the truth tends to do. It has that power to penetrate. So we have this sharing of the truth. And again, for the person who is sick, it can come in a lot of different ways. They might see a TV commercial. They may be talking to a friend. A judge may send them down to a counseling agency to get some counseling services that they don't think that they need. But in the course of all that, the truth gets shared and a seed gets planted, and it becomes very, very important again and very powerful. But in and of itself, this will not lead to a change. So there should be no expectation that if we could just finally share this truth with this person, that's going to bring about this remarkable transformation, because it's not. Because you have to remember that the person is fighting. They are absolutely in a life and death struggle with a chemical that has taken over their mind, body, and spirit. They are held hostage. And it's going to take more than just the sharing of the truth to be able to penetrate that. And that's where consequences become so very important. And again, these consequences that we start looking at have to do with just the natural course of events that happen in the life of the addict or alcoholic. But remember, part of my job as an addict is to make sure that I don't experience these consequences, to make sure that they get shifted off to somebody else, that somebody else takes responsibility for that. And again, we've talked about role and relationship, and the fact that one of the things that's so very painful for family members is that as the addiction starts to grow within the person and within their life and within your life, what happens is that family members start to play a role in the crisis that emerges. There's crisis after crisis, and there is a role to be played by family members. And that role will involve, giving money, bailing out of jail, helping make excuses, helping to blame other people. There's a lot of different things that happen within that role, but the role is primarily about what role do you play in helping me to avoid the consequences that I'm creating with my drug and alcohol use. And as those consequences grow, then so does the role, of each family member. So when we start thinking then about the kind of consequences that happen, the kind of things that start to happen, we start to be able to recognize then that this person is growing more and more out of control, being controlled more and more by addiction, and the family then is also getting caught up in that whole crisis scenario. And then what we start to see is the emerging drama of addiction. The emerging drama. And it is truly, probably a better word would be melodrama. It is truly a drama that starts to play out that has a lot to do, again, with crises and the role then that family members play in all of this. And it becomes a swirling drama that people become very susceptible to as time goes on. And again, one of the things that families are really struggling with all the time is their own denial. Because what do we want most of all for our loved ones? We want everything to be normal. We don't, when these kids were born and we started to raise them, or when we got into this marriage and started this family, or when we have parents, we did not set out with the idea that there was going to be some kind of serious problem there. We weren't prepared for it. We want things to be normal. So one of the things that happens with families oftentimes is the family becomes kind of the equilibrium for the alcoholic or addict. In other words, I go out and create a crisis, a problem that looks very abnormal, and then the family's job is to make it look normal, to try and fix it in some way, to try and wrap it in some kind of package that says, well, the reason that they got that DUI is that they were under a lot of stress and they just happened to drink a little bit too much that night. Or the police was picking on them and was just laying in wait for some reason. Or it didn't happen at all. It didn't happen at all. Or the reason that they're drinking this much is because of what somebody else is doing. Family problems, this problem. But the family will get caught up, especially early on in the progression of the disease, will get very caught up in this idea of trying to create this equilibrium, within the family. So as the alcoholic gets kind of sicker and sicker, then there's this pressure to do more and more to try and fix it so that things look normal. And again, that becomes extremely stressful for family members, extremely stressful. So the role that consequences start to play starts to become very, very important. Let me stop here and just see if there's any questions anybody has before I kind of move on to the next thing.
Can you hit multiple bottoms?
Can you hit multiple bottoms? I think what you'll hear most every recovering person describe is just exactly that. They will say, well, this series of events happened in my life as a result of my drinking or drug use, and I made a decision to do something different. And I was going to get help, or I decided to quit, or I decided to get away from those old friends. They decided to make some changes. But frequently, they're making those decisions based upon their own thoughts, their own thinking, their own experience. And most people don't have any experience with what do you do to recover. So they just kind of do the best they can, and then it doesn't work. And so they experience new consequences. And then they hit another bottom, another one of those periods. And what we will almost always see is people will describe several different kind of very critical times in their life that led them finally to a point where they're willing to say, I need help and somebody else has got to tell me how to get that help. So yes, I think it's pretty rare that somebody has that first crisis, that first experience, and they take action out of that. It's almost always kind of a multiple hitting these crisis points that finally leads somebody to make a decision.
What does high bottom, the term high bottom?
High bottom. What does the term high bottom mean? It's a good question because we hear that low bottom, kind of high bottom. And that is a term that you'll probably hear within 12-step recovery community in terms of people that haven't lost everything. And again, what we saw when, say, the 12-step group Alcoholics Anonymous got started, it was primarily people who had lost everything, who had had multiple hospitalizations, who had lost families and jobs. We're very much at that far end as far as progression of the disease was concerned, very late stage. But as they shared their story of what happened to them, then other people heard in their stories that, you were alcoholic when you started your recovery, but you were also alcoholic a year before that, and 5 years before that, and 10 years, and people started hearing about the progression. And so all of a sudden people start responding then to being able to change their definition so that a lot of people that get sober today, they have a lot of things intact. They may have families and jobs and cars and all of those things are in place. And so they would be looked at as they came into recovery before they lost a lot of those things. And that would be looked at as a more of a kind of a high bottom in terms of the vernacular of looking at bottom.
I have a question.
Sure.
Why can't the addict see what's going on in their life? Why are they not aware of it?
Why can't the addict see what's going on in their lives? That is the question that just dogs the family over and over and over again. And it has to do with, as the disease progresses and as bad things happen, and as the disease becomes more obvious, there is a corresponding growth or progression of the denial process. So, 2 or 3 things, new things, bad things happen to me, but my denial is also hardening in terms of I am not able to see. The alcoholic hates to hear someone say, "Can't you see what you're doing to me? Don't you see what you're doing to yourself and all the people around you?" And the obvious question, the answer to that is to argue or just to feel really lousy. I know whenever I heard that question, I felt really guilty, and then I'd probably turn that guilt into getting angry at the person that just asked it and accuse them of stuff. But the real answer would have been, no, I really can't see what you're talking about. I mean, I know there's some problems, but I think you're really blowing them out of proportion. You're really making a little bit too much of it. You're putting me to blame for things that I'm not to blame for. There's a lot of bad luck happening to me. And that's the kind of thing that starts to happen with that denial process. It's actually a brain functioning problem. What part of the body do we need the most to reason and make good decisions? Well, it's the brain. That's where that stuff happens. What part of the body is most affected by drug and alcohol use? The brain. That very thing we need to be able to say, 10 things have happened to me that are bad here in this last year, and they all had to do with my drinking. That kind of thing doesn't happen in the mind of the alcoholic. That kind of reasoning doesn't happen. If it starts to happen, something interrupts it, and that's the disease. The disease interrupts it and then diverts it. If I start to think, I wonder if my getting fired had anything to do with my drink. No, it was that co-worker that was just always sucking up to the boss, or it was that employer that just had it out for me, or I was sick, I had the flu, and they blamed me for being absent for work because I was sick. That's the kind of process, and the addict doesn't have any control over that. That just happens within the mind, and again, and it becomes mysterious to everybody around. And it looks like lying. That's one of the things that's very hard for family members, employers, co-workers, friends, is that it looks like lying. Like I'm just, I can't tell the truth. No, the world that I live in as the alcoholic is a very different world than what, the one that you live in and the one that you see happening to me. It's just a different experience. Any other questions? All right, let's talk about these crises a little bit. Let's pretend that these circles up here are the various critical points in the addict's life, and we could just draw them on it. The blackboard was 20 foot long. We'd just keep going with them. They just keep getting bigger. But what we notice is that if we call each of these a crisis, each of these is one of those critical times where the alcoholic addict gets in all kinds of trouble because of their drug or alcohol use. And what you'll see is that they just get bigger. In other words, it's a progressive disease, and so the crises get bigger over time. And we could probably, if we did this accurately, we would space these out a little bit differently too. That there might be, here's the first crisis, and we'll pretend for this example that this one might be the person got a DUI. They were 20 years old and they got a DUI back here. And again, a lot of people get DUIs. A lot of people who don't have drug or alcohol problems get a DUI. And so here we are at this first crisis. And at that first crisis, there will be a reaction to that. There'll be a reaction to that crisis. And there may be people suggesting that there's a drug or alcohol problem, maybe not. There may be people rallying around and saying, well, we'll help you, we'll take care of this, we'll help pay for your high-risk insurance, we'll get you out of jail, we'll pay for you to go to the driving school, whatever it is that we have to do, we'll get you out of this. And again, there's no reason to think at this point, on the part of family members or the addict themselves, that there's anything that's really out of the ordinary. This is just an unfortunate event that took place. But again, if it's addiction, they will just keep happening. And again, there might be a lot of period of time between the first crisis and the second, but there will be a second, and there will be a third, and they will keep happening, they will keep getting bigger, and they will start happening more closely together. There will be less time between these events. Now, when a crisis happens, we see the two most important tools that an addict or an alcoholic has, and that is an apology and a promise. An apology and a promise. The two extremely important tools. I'm so sorry for what has happened, and I promise I won't do it again. And it will always take that form in some way or another. It will always look similar to that. So back here at this first crisis, probably the best way for me to describe this is to give you an actual example. Several years ago, I got a call from a mother, and she was describing the situation, the problem that her son had gotten into. And I hadn't learned at that point that you have to ask very early in the conversation, how old is your son? Because I thought we were talking about a teenager. Because the description, if you remember, there's that age regression. People, as the disease progresses, family members start seeing the addict or alcoholic like they are back in their teenage years. They start interacting with them like they are, like they're the parent again. Even spouses will start acting the parent role in terms of that. Again, another one of those roles that we will see. But I finally ascertained that we were talking about a 30-year-old instead of a 16-year-old. And the problem is that he had gotten maybe the second DUI, second kind of legal thing. And her question to me is that I don't want him to have to go to jail. I want to see what we can do about getting help or doing this. And my suggestion was, why don't we not do anything? Why don't we let the natural course of events take place? The answer to that was, I can't stand the thought of him having to spend a night in jail. I just can't, he'll miss work. he might lose his job. There were those kind of things. All those concerns that she had about this problem right here. And so she really couldn't follow through. So she got him out of jail. She paid the fine. She got the high-risk insurance. She really kind of took care of getting things fixed. Well, I get a call a year later, and we're into another problem, another crisis. I think this one was more family-related. And again, it was, how do I intervene as his mother? How do I intervene in this situation? How do I kind of help pick up the pieces? What can I do? My suggestion, how about we not do anything? You know, I'm surprised she kept calling me back, you know, getting the same answer to the same question, essentially. But she couldn't do that. And again, I understood how hard it was, because guess what? The consequences he was facing here were bigger than here. The stakes, the stakes had now gone up. So now we were not talking about 3 days in jail, you know, or having to pay his own fines, or losing his driver's license for 6 months. We weren't talking about that. We were talking about something bigger. And she could not but not help. So another year or two goes by, another phone call, and he's in another jam. This time it's another legal problem. This one's bigger. This one's bigger. And again, my suggestion was, why don't we not do anything? Yes, but he's facing 6 months in jail. The judge is going to send him away for 6 months if I don't do something. And so she paid the lawyer. She got him out of trouble. He got probation. Well, very short period of time after that, a next problem came up. This problem is another legal issue, and now he's facing 5 years in prison. But guess what? She can't get him out of this one. She hasn't got the power. There's nothing, there's no amount of money, no amount of anything, there's no amount of work on her part that's going to get him out of that. So he was out here looking at 5 years of prison, of which he did 3. He spent 3 years in prison. Now, again, not to fault this mother, because again, she was doing the very best she could with the understanding that she had, and with the power that this disease and this fear, you know, instills in family members. But the question becomes is that at what point in time may he have taken action had he experienced the consequences that he was creating? Now, what we know is that an alcoholic or an addict will not get sober, will not even attempt to get better for real, until they are at least one problem beyond the family's ability to fix it, or the family's willingness to fix it. And that's what we're working on here today, is changing our willingness to fix it. Essentially saying, well, maybe even if she could have fixed this problem, if she didn't, then the consequences. And this person's sober today. This person got into a program while they were in prison, is sober today. But look at the consequences that had to unfold here. And sometimes, again, like we know, we might have 100 of these kind of situations that unfold. But at each point, what would happen, and again, this is a very common experience for families. The crisis occurs, we get the apology, we elicit a promise. The promise is key, because that's when the family starts trying to say, okay, but you got to promise me you're going to get a job. You got to promise me you're going to take care of your kids. You might not be asking back here about drinking and drugging, because you might not know enough about that yet. At some point in time, it's going to be, but you've got to quit drinking, you've got to quit using, you've got to pay your own bills, you've got to promise not to hang around with those friends. You know, a whole list of promises that can be elicited at each of these crises. But if you're getting a promise as a family member, that guarantees that this problem is going to happen. If the person doesn't experience these consequences, it guarantees that these are going to happen. So what we're really doing as family members when we essentially circumvent the consequence process is we're guaranteeing the next crises. We're guaranteeing that it's going to happen. And as I mentioned before, as each of these grow, it gets harder to say no, because now we're talking about big stakes. We're talking about, you know, stuff that's harder to say no to, because the consequences have now gotten bigger. So our goal then, as family members, is to look and start to see, what role is it that I play in this process? What is it that I do in this whole course of events when the crisis arises? You know, when the crisis comes, what's my job? And again, oftentimes we may say, well, you know, there's a whole bunch of family members involved here, and I'm the only one attending the loved ones group. I'm the only one that's accessing this information. And that may be true. There may be other people that are playing a role. But we also know that, again, if one person in the family makes some changes, it can be very powerful in terms of what being able to look at the role. Now, what are the different roles that family members play? Well, there's some primary ones that family members play. One would be what we'll call the primary rescuer, or the alcoholic's brain, you might say. The primary rescuer is kind of like the point guard on a basketball team, the quarterback on a football team. The primary rescue is the one that orchestrates the various events that need to happen to either get the person out of trouble or to avoid trouble happening. And that's the reason I say alcoholic's brain. Oftentimes family members somebody in the family becomes the alcoholic's brain. That's the person that's saying, did you remember to pay your electric bill? You know, don't go out and drink unless you have somebody to bring you home. Do this, do that. They're always thinking ahead, looking out into the future, trying to determine what is it that I need to tell them, to help them with, to keep them from avoiding the consequences that their disease, is creating. And it's that primary rescuer. And the primary rescuer is the person that's under a tremendous amount of stress, because that's the person that's going to, when the crisis happens, that's the person that will have the main responsibility for solving the problem. And again, there'll be others, there'll be other people, but that primary rescuer is the one that's in that. The primary rescuer is the one that also knows that when I get that promise, I feel better. When we get through this crisis and they make me a promise that there's certain things they're going to do or certain things they're going to stop doing, I'm going to get a little bit of feeling good time. And it becomes almost like the drug. It's like I have to go through all of this to get this little moment. Now, in the beginning, they didn't even recognize that was happening. But as time goes on, we realize that the only time we get a relationship with our loved one, when we're not locked up in that role, the only time we get a relationship is right after we've bailed them out of trouble, fixed whatever problem was going on. Then we get this little time where they're very grateful. They're willing to do whatever. The promises are being made, and there might be some effort to keep those promises, because the part that no one knows is that the person is unable, because of the growing disease, to keep their promises. And that's going to guarantee what's going to happen next. They're not going to keep the promise, and they're going to use again, or they're going to do whatever, and we're going to be in the next crisis, and the primary rescuer then is going to be very angry. Very angry. And they may make a decision, I'm not going to bail you out of this trouble. And then the negotiation begins. Well, if you don't bail me out of this trouble, here's what's going to happen to me. Here's what's going to take place. You don't love me. You'll never see the grandkids again. I'll kill myself. All kinds of things happen as a result then in terms of the person saying no. And for however angry, we know we've talked about anger and pity, for however angry I get at the addict or alcoholic, I will have a corresponding feeling of pity that will come in right on the heels of that. So I might be very angry saying, no, I'm not going to fix this problem. You're on your own. You just have to go to jail. You just have to lose a car. Whatever it is that's happening, it'll just have to happen. But then an hour, a day, a week later, the pity thing starts to emerge and hit the family member, and then they start looking for ways to help. And the first thing they'll do is they'll probably say something like, well, now if you'll promise me you will. And then that sets up the scenario for things to get fixed, to make sure that we've got the next problem, to guarantee the next crisis is going to happen. That becomes, because addiction is a manipulation of the family, of those people around them, to get what it wants. And it can't help it. The addict is not sitting around saying, well, if I say this to mom, I'll get this. If I say this to dad, if I tell the judge, the addict's not thinking that way. The disease thinks that way. The disease is running the show, and it thinks of all of those kind of things. So the primary rescuer, that primary person that steps into the fray, when the real crisis comes in, that's the person that's going to be, kind of the lightning rod for everything that happens. Wherever you've got a primary rescuer, you've probably got a critic. And that's probably another family member, very close, that is standing to the side, essentially criticizing everything that the primary rescuer is doing. But at the same time, inwardly, very grateful that the primary rescuer is doing it. I want somebody to go get my child out of jail, but I don't want to be the one that does it because I'm too angry. And so the critic is usually stepping to the side, essentially criticizing everything that's going on in the situation. Frequently, if we're talking about an adult child, teenager or adult child, you have two parents, and you've got one the primary rescuer, and you've got one that's the critic. If it's a spouse, you may have the other spouse, the sober spouse, that's the primary rescuer, and then you may have another family member, maybe that person's mother, the mother-in-law, that is the critic, that's criticizing everything that's taking place. Now, the interesting thing about this is that I've had both of those people in my loved ones group before. I've had the primary rescuer and the critic. And lo and behold, when the primary rescuer says, you know what, I'm not going to do it anymore. This is right. I'm not going to give money. I'm not going to get out of jail. I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to loan my car. I'm not going to do these things. The critic will step forward and do them. Invariably, the critic will have their turn as the primary rescuer, because it's just been too easy to be over here criticizing the whole process, while at the same kind of time being able to take comfort that my child's not in jail, my spouse, didn't lose their job today, whatever the crisis was. So that is a common experience where the critic, again, will become the primary rescuer if somebody else stops it. We also will have a secondary enabler or a secondary rescuer. If something happens to the primary rescuer, if they're not available, maybe they're just not available that day, there is a backup. Grandparents are wonderful in this role. Grandparents are absolutely wonderful. They're good, but there will be a secondary enabler that will be able to step in and essentially do what is necessary in this crisis, whether it be money or whatever.
I was going to ask, is that typically due to the fact that the secondary may not know all the details? Or is it that they may know the details? Is there generally a correlation?
The question being, is it because the secondary rescuer, doesn't know all the facts, all the things that are going on? I say yes, absolutely, that could be it. Again, the family is working very hard for everything to look normal. And oftentimes there might be another family member that really doesn't know what this is about. So I come to you and I'm asking for money and I'm telling you what it's all about. I don't know that the money's really about buying drugs. I don't know that information because everybody's been so secretive about this whole thing. So I'm vulnerable to step right into that enabling, rescuing role simply because I don't know what's going on. Or the secondary enabler might be also someone who fits what another role might be, and that might be what I call the backseat driver. And that is somebody that wants to stay out of it, doesn't want to be the one giving money, shelter, fixing things, going to the jail, doing those things, but wants to direct everything that is going on. And so that's the one that when the primary rescuer is not doing a very good job of their rescuing, they will get a phone call. A critical phone call, essentially, well, have you thought of doing this, or should you do that? And when the primary rescuer tries to change their behavior, oftentimes that backseat driver is the one that'll step in and really kind of give them a very hard time of, why aren't you going down and doing this? Why aren't you giving them money? How can you do this? Why are you being so thoughtless? But secretiveness becomes a real part of what happens to some family members. They just don't know what's going on because it's been such a big secret. We will also have, and this can be multiple people, sympathizers. And if you're the person that the addict or alcoholic comes to talk about their feelings, look out. Now you're in trouble. If you're the one they can talk to, be careful, because again, that sympathy part is another way of feeling normal. If I've got somebody that shows this sympathy, that comes and kind of wraps their arms around me and tells me everything is going to be okay, that assures me that that I'm not a bad person. There's not these things that are going on aren't really my fault. That is willing to play that role, come up with advice, play the yes but game. Have you ever played the yes but game? The yes but game is I come to you with with a problem. Serious problem. And you start giving me very rational things that I can do about it, and to every one of those I say, yes, that would probably work, but, and then I tell you why it won't work. And after an hour, 3 hours, all night, we finish this conversation, and essentially I feel better because I've talked, somebody showed me a lot of sympathy, you're worn out, and nothing's changed. Nothing's changed. So if you are the shoulder that the person cries on, you're in trouble. You're in trouble in that role because, again, that's the disease. And again, what would work with other kind of problems doesn't work with addiction. Again, being sympathetic, being helpful, helping somebody in a bad jam. I mean, that's what we do with people we love. We do those kind of things, and it works very well if it's not addiction. But if it's addiction, it will not work. It just guarantees that the problem is going to grow and get bigger and bigger and bigger. In addition to the roles I just mentioned, we also have people that I'll kind of refer to as the forgotten ones. A lot of times these are other children in the family. You have a 20-year-old or an 18-year-old that has a drug problem, and then you also have a 16-year-old, and the 16-year-old's doing okay. But because of this crisis that is always happening in the life of the addict and the way they pull the family, you have family members that get just kind of forgotten in the whole process. They get lost in this. And they can become very angry as well in terms of what's going on. I had a family member tell me recently that they were thinking about bringing an addicted son back into their home. And they said, our other two kids told us that if they do that, they're leaving. Because they remember what that's all like, is that when that person was living in the home, it was just a constant crisis centered around that person and the parents, and that they essentially, were getting all kinds of consequences happening to them. Another thing that's mysterious about this to family members is that a lot of times family members do not see what they're doing in terms of the progressing problems and consequences that are taking place. An example was a father that came up to me after a loved ones group one night and said, "My son has hit rock bottom." And I said, "Well, tell me about that." And he said, "Well, he was in jail, 3rd DUI, he's facing this problem, that problem." He went through a whole litany of things that was going on. And I said, "Well, let's talk about just the thing that happened the other night." And I said, "He got picked up for his 3rd DUI. He said, "That's right. He was in jail." And I said, "What happened then?" He said, "Well, I went and got him out of jail." I said, "How did you do that?" And he said, "Well, I had to put up a $500 bond." And I said, "Well, then what happened?" "Well, he's lost his driver's license too." That's another example of hitting rock bottom. He has no driver's license. And I said, "Well, how's he getting around?" "Well, his mother and I are driving him around." He says, "He can't work anymore. He lost his job." And I said, "Well, how is he paying his bills?" "Well, we're paying his bills. We're keeping things going. We're keeping up his apartment and giving him grocery money and this kind of thing." I said, "Somebody hit rock bottom, but I don't think it was your son." Again, because who had the consequences happen to? All the consequences had happened to the father and the mother. And I can remember later on, this son came into recovery. And he talked about being in jail on that 3rd DUI. He talked about it. He said, I heard him telling that story, and he said, "I was in that jail, and I was looking around, and I said, you know what, here it is. This is what my life has come to. I'm looking at all these other people in jail. I don't have any money. I don't have any cigarettes. I don't have anything. They don't have anything. And I'm going to be in this jail. I'm probably going to have to serve, 3 months on this charge and all this kind of stuff." He says, right about the time I was thinking that, the jailer came up and said, "Hey, come on, your dad's here to bail you out." And he jumped up and he said, "The first thought I have is, my God, I'm glad I'm not like the rest of these people." That's denial. You asked that question about denial. There it was. Sitting around there looking at that saying, "Oh my God, look where my life has come as a result of my drinking." And then instantly, once the crisis lifted just a little bit, the disease stepped right in and said, "I'm not like these other people that have to stay in this jail. I'm different." And the disease lives on that, being able to find those differences, not experiencing those consequences. But again, this father, it was a mystery to him. He thought that all of those things were happening to his son, and there were things happening, but mostly they were happening to him. And he was the one that was suffering through all of those consequences. And again, it was very hard for him to think about changing any of those things, not doing any of the things that he had done, because that all had consequences. Well, if I'd have left him in jail, I wouldn't have been able to sleep because worrying about him. If he didn't have a car, then how would he get, all of those kind of things. He had assumed those problems. And that's what addiction does to family members. It makes family members feel responsible to fix the problems that are being created by this disease. And unfortunately, a person will never recover if they do not experience those consequences. Any of these events might be bottom. Any one of them might be the very thing that essentially motivates that person to make a decision to get some kind of help, to be able to do something different. And again, that process in and of itself takes time, but it can't get started until the person starts experiencing their own consequences. Questions or comments about what we've been talking about here so far? Yes.
So, but instinctively as a parent, you know, you want to help your child. You don't want, if they don't have food, if they need groceries, or, you know, their car is broken down, we shouldn't do that either. It's not helping anything.
The question is that instinctively as parents we have become, that's our job. Our job is to step in and help when there's not a need for groceries or transportation or whatever the need is. And again, that would be helpful under normal circumstances. But with addiction, all it does is guarantee the next problem. So essentially, the question for family members becomes, when do I start saying no? At what point in time do I draw the line and say, I'm not going to participate in the progression of the disease any longer? Because again, we know that eventually this person has an opportunity to get well, but how far will they have to go before they finally get consequences that you can't fix? You know, when do they finally, end up in a hospital for an overdose, something that you can't be fixed? When do they finally end up in prison? When do they lose everything and end up like that definition of somebody that's homeless? That will eventually happen regardless of what the family does. I remember a family member said, well, I want them to live with me because I'm afraid if they get out of the house, that they'll overdose and die. At least I can keep an eye on them like this. Not really. Not really, because the addiction is still happening. The real risk of overdose is using the drug, not where the person uses the drug. But again, that's how mysterious this thing can be for family members, thinking that she was protecting her son while all she was really doing was guaranteeing him a safe place to get high. Safe place in the sense of shelter. But anybody that's getting high, that's not safe. And a person can die just as easily in somebody's living room as they